You're probably familiar with the story of the Monuments Men, the group of curators and archivists who went to Europe toward the end of World War II to find and salvage priceless works of art that had been confiscated and looted by the Nazis. But what happened after the war is just as fascinating and just as intriguing as the rescue operation itself, and it has a Cincinnati connection. The Cincinnati Art Museum is presenting Paintings, Politics, and the Monuments Men now through October the 3rd. And Peter Jonathan Bell is the co-curator of the exhibition. Peter, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure, Betsy.
Before we start talking about the exhibition itself, let's talk a little bit about the Monuments Men. As I said, a lot of people are familiar with the story, either through books or, of course, our friend George Clooney did a movie on the Monuments Men. But these were not soldiers to begin with. They were art experts who were recruited to go over and really save European art history. Talk a little bit about their mission and what they had to do.
Right. So the Monuments Men is the sort of unofficial name for this group of people brought together under the Monuments, Fine Art, and Archives section within the Army, beginning in 1941, I believe, when the U.S. started thinking, and with allied partners, about the sort of the catastrophic consequences of the war, of the Nazi invasion of Europe, and the war on cultural patrimony. That that people were really thinking of as the patrimony of the world, not just of the nation states that were involved in that conflict. So as you rightly say, these were not, for the most part, not Army officers and soldiers, but rather individuals drawn from the private and public sector in the United States for their expertise: art conservators, curators, museum professionals, art historians who had a deep knowledge of the artworks that were at peril in Europe. And you think about being a time long before Google and so forth. And so this knowledge about whether it's the paintings that are in a given museum or the 12th century monastery on this hill outside of that town, these were people whose knowledge was really important especially in the waning days of the war, as the Allied armies pushed the Nazis back across Europe, and the Germans were doing a lot of damage to artworks and architecture in the wake of that.
And if some of the stories are to be believed, some of the Allied commanders were not necessarily thinking about saving pieces of art.
It was really a tricky moment, I can't imagine, and I'm sure there was some of that backing and forthing when you think about the military's main objective of protecting their own soldiers and defeating the enemy. Taking care of this building or that painting naturally seems pretty far down on the list. But I think that the mere fact of the impaneling of this Monuments, Fine Art, and Archivist division shows the seriousness with which the U.S. Army, the U.S. administration, and their allies in Britain especially, how seriously they were taking the long-term consequences to some of the greatest expressions of our humanity, our painting and sculpture and architecture.
So let's fast forward to when these works of art were found. They were discovered in homes. Many were stored in abandoned mines around Germany. So they were found, they were categorized, they were all brought together, but then you could say almost that they were hijacked again. Some of these were brought to the United States, and that's where the Cincinnati connection comes in with Walter Farmer.
Right at the end of the war, in the summer of 1945, the General Patton's army is moving through Germany towards Berlin and comes across one of these repositories for precious things that the Nazis were secreting away so to avoid aerial bombardment. And in this particular location in Merkers, they found the entire gold reserves of Germany as well, and cheek by jowl with the gold bars were hundreds and thousands of artworks, and these were the collections of the Berlin State Museums. So the public collections of art, paintings, prints, the library archives from Berlin that had been moved to this site for their safety. The army moved these artworks out of the salt mine as the war ended, and the U.S. Army was establishing a series of what they called collecting points, so secure facilities in cities, strategic cities in the U.S. sector of divided Germany, where they could collect all of the displaced artworks and artifacts, whether it was looted artworks that the Nazis had stolen from oftentimes Jewish collectors or gallerists, or whether it was artwork like the paintings they found in the salt mine that were property of the German people, of this public museum that had been hidden, put away for their own safety, as it were. So Walter Farmer, our longtime Cincinnatian, was the monuments man who was in charge of the Wiesbaden collecting point. And this was the site that the army chose for all of the artworks that were not looted, for the artworks that were not stolen by the Nazis as they were crossing Europe. And so the paintings from Berlin came under Walter Farmer's care in the summer of 1945 in Wiesbaden. And very soon thereafter, in the early fall, there came an order that 200 works of greatest importance of German art should be moved to the United States. And as you said, this was ostensibly for their safekeeping, but Walter Farmer and all of the monuments men in Germany at that time, for the most part, had a real issue with this, because it seemed way too close to what they had just been fighting against, the sort of instrumentalization of art for political and strategic ends. And so Walter got this order. He pulled together all the monuments men in Germany, and they drafted a document that would become known as the Wiesbaden Manifesto. And this was a very rare sort of example of officers protesting against their orders in this conflict. Some say it's the only example of this. And they sent this document to their commanding officer, who declined to pass it up the chain of command. But it was a really very principled stand on the part of these men and women. I point out that we say monuments men, but there were many women who were also involved in this operation. So this document was subsequently leaked to the press and created quite a stir when these artworks in fact did come to the United States in late November and early December of 1945. So the operation happened. These 200 paintings were taken to the coast and shipped to New York and put on a train to the National Gallery of Art, very brand new building of the National Gallery of Art at that time, and put in storage there. But it was an episode that generated considerable controversy in the press, in the art world in the United States, in these months right after the end of the war. And it was our own Walter Farmer who took the first stand, as it were, questioning the morality of transferring these works so soon after the end of the war outside of Germany.
And Walter Farmer became quite a loyal patron of the arts in our area once the war was over and he came back home. But let's now talk about the exhibition that we'll see at the Cincinnati Art Museum, Paintings, Politics, and the Monuments Men. So what will we see?
What you'll see is some 27 paintings or so and several works on paper. At the center of this exhibition, we wanted to highlight the story of these 202 paintings. This is about Walter Farmer, but the project begins with Walter Farmer because of the Cincinnati connection, but it expanded into really, I think, quite an important research project and analysis of this moment in history. So these 202 paintings, after they came to the United States, in spite of the Monuments Men protests, they were stored at the National Gallery for 2 years until President Truman essentially thought it was time to send them back to Germany. That things there were safe enough for us to return these collections. But first, they were put on view at the National Gallery of Art in the spring of 1948. And in something like 5 weeks, 960,000 people saw them. Almost 1 million people packed through this exhibition. It was, far and away the biggest exhibition in terms of attendance that had ever happened, I think, in terms of art museums. We talk about blockbuster exhibitions as beginning several decades later than that, in the 1970s with the Metropolitan Museum, but this show was incredibly appreciated in Washington, and so naturally Congress saw this and said, okay, what about our constituents, and legislated that these paintings should then tour to across the country. So the Army arranged an exhibition tour, as it were, 13 cities across the country in 1948 and into 1949. And all told, at the end of that tour, almost, I think it's 2.4 million people had seen these paintings, and that's over 1.5% of the entire U.S. population at the time, which was something in our research that we just found staggering. So this was an incredible opportunity for people in the United States to see one of Europe's great collections of paintings. And that for us sort of made a counterbalance in terms of the ethical scale. It wasn't just as straightforward as we thought, that this was a bad thing that the US Army did by taking these paintings out of Germany. There were benefits to a lot of people towards the end of this. So in our exhibition, sorry, that was a long story there, but in our exhibition, we'll be highlighting these 202 paintings from Berlin. We've got 4 of those paintings on loan to us from the Gemälde Gallery in Berlin. The 202, as we call them, to see them today, you need to go to Berlin, and they are in fact the core of the paintings collection of the State Museums of Berlin, as they were in 1945. So we were very lucky to have 4 of these paintings join us. And we're fleshing out that section by installing works from our own collection, from the Cincinnati Art Museum's collection, by artists who were represented in the 202, by artists that you would have seen in 1948, 49, if you'd gone to this exhibition. And it gives you a sense of what an all-star cast of old masters this is, from Mantegna and Botticelli to Rubens, Titian, Memling, Cranach, up to Claude Lorrain and Antoine Watteau. It's a really astounding collection of the history of European painting. So that's at the core of the central part of the exhibition. We also wanted to show people, to give some context to why this was such a controversial episode, and why what people did with art and where it was moved at this moment would have been such a lightning rod. And so to do that, we're looking also at art policy and art practices during the Nazi regime in the 1930s in Germany, and as the war progressed in the 40s. And so looking at some of the themes that I think many people will be more familiar with from this history, which is looting of art. The Nazis were voracious at looting private and public collections for their own personal gain and for political ends. Also, the policies of degenerate art, whereby they branded largely German expressionist style of art as un-Aryan and not fit for the new society they were creating, and sort of ostracizing a lot of modern artists in Germany at the time and confiscating their works. So we delve into those issues in order to set the scene for our Berlin 202. And then visitors will also see sections on Walter Farmer and the Wiesbaden Manifesto, and we have some documents on display and descriptions so that we get a sense of that important moment, and then also of Walter's legacy here in Cincinnati. As you mentioned earlier, he was instrumental in many arts organizations. He helped found the Miami University Art Museum, donated a number of works there, and to us here at the Cincinnati Art Museum. So we have some of those artworks that from his collection that he gave to the museum as well.
You talked about the global issue of saving this art history and the importance of making sure that it gets back to its rightful place and its rightful owners. What kind of lessons can we learn in this modern age? Because every once in a while we still hear about a painting that we thought was lost, and all of a sudden it pops up. And does it go back to the original owner? What kind of lessons can we learn about art, its creation, and its ownership? Is it owned or is it for the people?
That's you're really getting to the nub of it there, Betsy. It's this combination. I think, so much of what we hear now, and especially in the last 20 years, in this sort of new interest in the history of ownership of artworks, and a lot of that is driven by descendants of many of the people whose artwork was stolen and disappeared during these years. Many of the Jewish collectors and owners of artwork who were separated from their family heirlooms, from their valuable investments, from their connections to themselves and their family. And so the whole legal apparatus around restitution claims has really come into its own in the last 20 years, and that's a big part of why it's important to look carefully at where a painting, for instance, has been over the course of its lifetime. But and on the bigger one of the bigger issues, I think, also is at the core of why we have public art museums, and exactly as you suggest, that regardless of ownership, that we treat many of these works of art as a shared legacy of some of the highest potential of humans and of cultures and across time, and that this kind of achievement and manifestation of our spirit is something that really needs special protection, let's say, that needs extra concern in times of war and in times of peace. And as you brought up earlier, I think in times of war, when there's so many other really, really important life and death concerns, the issue of art's role in society, of what it allows us to aspire to, and what it allows us to see about the history of ourselves and in the world is completely crucial.
Well, it's a fascinating look at history, and of course, as in so many of these stories, there's a Cincinnati connection that just adds even more intrigue to it. It is Paintings, Politics, and the Monuments Men. You can see it at the Cincinnati Art Museum until October 3rd. Peter Jonathan Bell, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure, Betsy. Thank you.